So what I'll do today is talk around a book project of mine that was 10 years in the making, basically. I started working on this in 2011, so yes, basically 10 years. And it's coming out in 2 weeks with MIT Press. So it's a book that basically looks at this kind of zeitgeist common diagnosis of network lives that tends to be, that is repeated in academic inquiry, in journalism, in all kinds of diagnoses from memes to whatever, according to which the devices and apps that we use and the platforms we use, social media in particular, are addictive. We are addicted, hooked on network media that then distracts us, so has very detrimental impact on our cognitive, affective skills, our ability to remember, to be, to relate, to feel. And then since it distracts us, we can't really focus, we end up being bored. And with boredom, this sense of flatness, affective flatness or nothingness, things don't really matter. And this argument that takes different shapes and forms, but it repeats in different variations and has been doing this for about a decade, maybe actually more. On the one hand, it's a very appealing, easy to relate theory, and like all narratives are lost, it's premised on things having sometimes been better. So the idea is that once there was a past when life were more full, we were less distracted, we could think, we would actually read, not just skim through and so forth. But then looking at, and I'm a media studies scholar, so looking at diagnoses of media and technology, going back to the electric telegraph, mid-19th century, we get very similar diagnoses, according to which the increasing speeds of information exchange flatten notions of importance. So with the invention of modern news, suddenly gossip becomes noteworthy. Things that wouldn't matter to people suddenly become worth of noting. And this idea of affective blandness, nothingness, distraction, it's actually striking for a zeitgeist diagnosis to repeat for almost 200 years. So we get the same with radio and cinema, with the work of Siegfried Kracauer, Walter Benjamin in 1920s and 30s. We get this later on with lots of work on television that entertains us to death, as Postman argued, and we definitely start getting it with network media. So my interest has been on this, what seems to be a very strong theory, kind of taken for granted thing, how it's lived in different technological contexts, but in particular, how it's used to make sense of the contemporary moment. I did my final revisions for the book a year ago in March. Academic publishing is very slow. So when I was self-quarantined with COVID, and I think in the past year, it's become, my basic argument is that we can think of dependence on network media as infrastructural, and this kind of dependence is not synonymous with addiction. My argument is that we should consider distraction as an issue of rhythm and tempo of attention. So not to think of distraction and attention as polar opposites or mutually exclusive. We need to attend to the different speeds of attention as they link to various platforms, apps, and forms of content, and social exchanges, obviously. And similarly, we can't make sense of boredom without attending to richness of experience, to moments of enchantment, really. So it's basically a book about ambiguity, but not relativism. That's the point. So I won't be talking about the framework of what I mean with the affective formation so much. We can go into that in the discussion bits. I'll talk more about the overall rationale of this project that I'm very happy to be having finished now. 10 years it's a long time. So I work in Finland, which is kind of obviously a privileged country in the so-called global north, but also something of a petri dish. Once the country of Nokia, the collapsed mobile communications giant that gave rise to SMS, that's our gift to the world. But it's also a country that has a very high internet connectivity. So in younger age groups, it's basically 99%. And in terms of mobile internet use, the data, there's more mobile data use in Finland than any country in Europe or even globally. So in that sense, it's an interesting kind of petri dish environment to be looking at infrastructural dependencies on network media. Most often, of course, dependencies, the idea that our lives are too saturated, the kind of solution offered is mostly that of detox, with the idea that we would find more authentic, meaningful ways of relating if we basically just logged off. And this is usually in this diagnosis of bored, distracted lives led through network media. This is the solution given. But when I started working on this project, I was really interested initially in the effective intensities of technological failure. So when there is no connectivity, when the devices we used on a mundane basis that we are kind of dependent on for our lives to work, when they don't work, what happens? So it started out like many things as an article. And I worked with my students. So they are BA students in media studies. So again, a very particular group, but I asked them to write little essays just describing how things feel. And there's a research permit, and I can go more into the pedagogical point of this. The pedagogical point was to teach actor network theory to humanities students who really don't like reading Latour. For reasons I'll never understand, they really don't like reading Latour. So I would basically use their own words to explain what agency might mean in the framework of network theory. And I'll just show you a few examples. I have about 170 of these essays that comprise one kind of the starting point for the book, although it then expands to all kinds of directions. So when we're thinking of infrastructure, in Ara Wilson, I mean, we can follow Ara Wilson's term of infrastructures as things that condition, that can be structural, they can be organizational, they can be material, or more kind of a social nature, but basically things that structure and give shape to our social lives. But in this particular articulation, infrastructural dependency takes on a very concrete form. So the student directly compares the lack of network connectivity to something elementary missing, like not having a toilet, and this would be the term she used. It was not a bathroom. So this basically speaks of mundane connectivity as a condition of everyday life. And if that is taken away, then the whole organization of everyday life becomes transformed. And usually the reaction to this is not happy. They are not very happy about the disconnections. And the similar logic repeats. So I would argue that this is something else than FOMO, or fear of missing out. Although the students do comment on FOMO, they're very ironic, many of these accounts. But it's more a sense of being concretely cut off from the world and social relationships. It's about inability to act in the world, because then you realize how dependent you are on network media for a range of things, be that, looking for a bus schedule, finding yourself on a map, being able to relate to people, or in the case of students, they can't study. Well, especially in the past year, they can't study without network connectivity. But even before, they wouldn't be able to use online learning platforms and hence actually do the work. So the sense of being cut off, being isolated, and not being able to act really is something that repeats. And in Finnish, the word riippuvuus, it's both dependence and addiction. And the students also play with this, but my suggestion from the beginning has been that these dependencies really don't speak of addiction. They speak of different kind of fundamental relating. So communication networks or internet infrastructures form a basis for all kinds of networks through which these people, or myself included, can act. So it's kind of a infrastructure, technological infrastructure gives rise to infrastructures of agency connected to different social roles and forms of being. So this notion of dependent keeps on repeating, and there is no really a sense of the sense of loss is connected to the fact of being offline without one's will. And although I asked about all kinds of media communication technologies failing, it was really, especially the past 7 years, it really was about network connectivity. Earlier, there was other kind of media stuff that also would evoke strong reactions when failing to operate. So my FOMO students, or not FOMO students, basically, I use this as a kind of a framing device to challenge this idea that detox would be a way to a fuller life. These students also complain about low speeds of connectivity that slow their speeds, their bodily kind of technosomatic speeds of life. They feel stuck, they can't operate when connections are too slow. They write, even yoga teachers, who preach about mindfulness, they want their technology to work very quickly. So the stories very much go against the grain of this, what I would call almost a master narrative of loss. They are also about moments of richness and meaningfulness in lives lived intimately with devices. Some of them write about prosthetic dependencies, because they are media studies students, they read McLuhan in some shape or form. But again, I would say that this notion of infrastructural dependence, and actually Blake Hallinan has just a couple of days ago has an article out in a cultural studies special issue on the politics of infrastructure. And he writes about kind of the infrastructural affordances and politics of Facebook. And I think this argument has become, in a way, self-evident in the past year, when in terms of how everyday lives are managed, for many of us, the division of online and offline that was once very structuring for internet research or internet inquiry, it really doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make much sense. This doesn't mean that that these connections, I mean, discourses of addiction basically imply that we are hooked on something we really kind of enjoy, or we seek enjoyment that then, because it's addiction, we can't get the feels we want, and hence our life forces are cut back, cut short. And this kind of non-contextualized take on addiction, which it cuts through a lot of internet addiction literature, it doesn't really pay attention to the different functions that network media play in everyday lives. I mean, I don't think all of this Zoom, we are doing it particularly because we are addicted for some thrill. There's a particular function to why we're doing it, and have been doing this for a year now. My students don't necessarily want to log into a online learning platform. They're not addicted to these affordances. So in a way, the argument about infrastructure, I think that's become kind of like obvious. But at least to myself at one point in time, it was not obvious. And of course, this leads to a question that is a problem to discuss and something that is not easy to solve, which has got the framework of all of this is data capitalism. So my argument for this kind of mundane infrastructural functions and dependencies, it's not, I hope, naive in that sense of saying like, oh, we just have this thing and everything's dandy, especially with COVID and seeing the rise in Facebook use by 500 million, I think, within a year. We really see the centralization of data culture in US-based data giants that control the forms that our sociability can take. And of course, we all know about the data practices and the kind of forms of monetization and some would argue exploitation involved in them. So that's a real issue. But this, I would argue, is more of a context for what I'm discussing. And my interest is more in how people become, in very ambiguous ways, attached to platforms, attached to exchanges that then move their bodies from one shape to another. And they can at the same time cut one's life forces short and amplify them. So with ambiguity, I'm not really talking about ambivalence, I'm talking about ambiguity in the sense that network media simultaneously is, I would say, ontologically very different things. And it does mutually contradictory things to social lives. It both increases our capacities to act and cuts them down at the same time. And to focus on one side of that equation would be erroneous. Yet the zeitgeist diagnosis really is focused on the loss. It's my argument that if we focus on ambiguity, we can talk about these irreconcilable tensions without doing away with them. And I think that's essential for critical well, humanities and social sciences inquiry. So I'm not just talking about happy feelings. But diagnosis of distraction it's one of these zeitgeist stories that really goes back to classics of sociology. So Simmel's discussion of the metropolitan life or the urban metropolis from 1906, I think, where he writes about there being so much stimulus in the urban environment, so much happening at such speeds that it's difficult to focus on anything, hence nothing really matters, and then boredom follows. And most diagnoses of distraction from Krakow beyond are rather dystopian, and they find support kind of in studies like Microsoft did a study 5-6 years ago, where they argued that the average attention span of a Canadian is now shorter than that of a goldfish. And then it became very clickbait worthy, got lots of attention, and there was this sense of concern, what's been done to us. But then again, if you talk with psychologists, there is no average attention span. Attention spans are about scales of importance and focus. So if you drive a car for the first time, you pay attention. If you drive a car for 1,000th time, you pay attention in a different kind of way. If you're reading an article that's not really too interesting, you might not focus too well. If it's really engaging, you might focus. So it's about scales of meaning. And I would argue that affect is key to that which makes things matter. So this meaning isn't always reducible to acts of signification in sense of meaning making. It can also be about kind of a connection that happens, a moment of impact, a surprise, a startle, something else, a sexual thrill maybe, that then makes these things and exchanges matter. And I would also argue that this idea that the increasing speeds of, let's say, app culture are atrophying our somatic affective capacities, they are blind to context. So in the sense that the one and the same person might enjoy a quick GIF and they might spend 2 hours building a GIF. People look at ASMR videos that are fairly long and not really speedy at the same time when they can enjoy a TikTok video. I mean, the average length of Hollywood blockbusters hasn't really grown very short. Films are long. I mean, Avengers Endgame is almost 4 hours, something ridiculous. Most popular book series, you might have many opinions about 50 Shades of Grey, but they are not short. It's a trilogy and the books are not short. So again, it's about different speeds, scales of interest, different platforms and different media forms. And if we theorize the contemporary based on the speed of a Snapchat, then I think that's really just sloppy. It's not very ambitious. So we really need to attend to these different rhythms, different speeds and context of exchange. And there are many studies about distraction attention and how attention becomes monetized and how this kind of quick grabbing of attention is essential to social media economy. And there definitely is that. There is the effective manipulation that happens with social media platforms. So it's not like a neutral, happy story of how our attention is clustered. It's also how attention and distraction become monetized. But my point basically being is that rather than focusing on distraction, we really need to consider distraction in terms of attention as they slide into one another. And this, in a way, was Jonathan Crary's argument about the speeds of modernity a while, I think it was the late 90s. But I think the same kind of structure of argument does apply to contemporary platforms as well. Now, boredom, and this is the in addition to dependence, distraction, there is boredom in terms of affective formations I address. Boredom is not an affect as such, it's a question of affective flatness, this moment where nothing really matters. And there's an argument that social media, well, on the one hand, like clickbaits, like Bored Panda, they promise to rescue us from boredom. On the other hand, there's the argument that social media bore us because it's like repetition without difference, basically. I would say both arguments are equally valid. Again, it's a question of ambiguity. I think both arguments do hold. And then the interesting question is how these two things play into and with one another. But in terms of zeitgeist diagnosis, boredom, again, it's a paradoxical narrative to use for framing the very contemporary, because it was basically 19th century mal du siècle, the disease of the century, there was the kind of blasé-ness, but there was basically boredom in connection with urban culture, in connection with industrialization, and then the kind of rise of media culture. They were all seen to breed boredom, basically. And if the zeitgeist narrative, again, if it can be applied to context over 150 years, I don't think it's a very strong zeitgeist narrative. It can be strong theory in the sense that Eve Sedgwick discusses strong theories, that they connect things randomly similar or different into one entity. And then this theory can be used to explain a range of developments. But it's also kind of circular in that the premise doubles as the outcome. So we know that things are bad, and then we discover the kind of badness of things. There is also an argument to be made, an argument that has been made for boredom as a kind of rescue. So building on diverse bodies of work, whether that be Heidegger or Benjamin's or Krakauer's musings on boredom, it's also been seen as like we are basically, the argument goes that we are being deprived with our right for boredom. And this, our right to boredom of kind of an elementary kind that then makes it possible to reflect on who we are and what the world is about. So there's the idea that we are not allowed to be bored enough in contemporary media culture. But then there's a strange kind of conflation of this sort of boredom as almost with mindfulness, actually. And then if we look at boredom of the fundamental kind that Heidegger discusses, for example, it's borderline, well, I think it's very similar actually, with diagnosis of chronic depression, as this mode where nothing matters, nothing moves, nothing touches you. Time seems to stand still. The future holds no promise of things changing. It's this kind of flatness, kind of the life of an emotional desert, or desert, not desert, desert, basically. And I would be wary to celebrate this form of boredom, kind of as nothingness, that where, you know, basically in clinical depression, a suicide might not be an unhappy option because it's a solution to this nothingness that one is feeling. So if we consider boredom on more dynamic terms, as involving this oscillation of affective intensity, so boredom being this kind of flatness, even nothingness maybe, at least kind of reduced sense of importance. It only makes sense in relation to something that is fuller and vice versa. So whether those are kind of these tiny micro nuggets of interest, excitement derived from social media, or something of a more lingering, persistent kind, it's, I think for me at least, it makes sense to look at things in a more dynamic tension. And again, the pandemic moment, it's really an interesting one. So against this background of diagnosis that social media bores us to death, that and in studies of everyday life, it's been noted that routines bore us. So routine life is boring. Now with the pandemic, things that are identified over decades as being causes to boredom are offered as solutions. So with COVID, we advise to create structure and repetition to our everyday lives so that there is some kind of like semblance of normality, in order for things not to be so boring. Similarly, social media is recommended, of course, in healthy doses, not too much, as a rescue from boredom. So these causes and cures really, in a way, shift places in interesting ways. And for me, that is a useful moment for really thinking about the premises of these kind of strong claims about what social media is doing to us and how, or what network media more broadly is doing to us. So here, I mean, if some of these diagnoses identify boredom as a solution, some of them as a problem, and in many of them, the question is, are you bored or are you depressed? Or are you depressed or just bored? But basically, in the large narrative that my project has been revolving around, and I'll wrap up, it is a story of loss. I mean, from I miss my pre-internet brain, so-called Canadian artist known for introducing the notion of Generation X once upon a time, that had become very kind of meme-worthy, easy to commodify. There is this idea of loss, that once my brain was better, it was more difficult to find information, and therefore information held more importance. It was more valuable. It was more difficult to find a film you wanted to see, and hence it was more important to see that film, even if the film was kind of crap. It still held importance as something you had been planning to do for 2 months. With this abundance of information, the argument goes, everything becomes flattened out. The argument is very similar to Simmel's. It's very similar to those made in relation with the electric telegraph a while ago. Now, key to this whole story of loss, it is it sort of builds on the narrative of disenchanted modernity that Max Weber, among others, articulated. He was not alone, but particularly influential in this. And of course, the premise of that is that with modernity, the speeds of modern life, the destruction of pre-modern communities creates this flatness, alienation, emptiness. The magic of religion becomes lost with rationalization. We are kind of hollowed out and empty. Now, my interest is in like, what losses are we calculating and how? I mean, if in this story of, if we take the story of disenchanted modernity, then what are we celebrating in terms of things lost? We are thinking then of pre-modernity as an age that didn't acknowledge human rights. We had serfs in Europe. Women definitely had no political rights. Only people of certain social class had any kind of political rights. Rights to bodily autonomy were not really acknowledged. And it's kind of rare to read analyses by queer scholars or activists, looking back to pre-modernity or looking back to early 20th century pre-internet ages as something that was really fantastic, or people of color, with the exception of indigenous populations, looking back to something of pre-modernity or even 19th century as like a lost age when things were really excellent. So one thing that really becomes striking when reading these stories of loss as they become repeated from one decade to another is who articulates them. And unsurprisingly, it tends to be members of the cultural elite, many of them older white men. So what this more kind of dynamic take on rhythms of experience and our ways of making sense of them in relation to lives lived in network media, I think it allows for telling a more complex story, and also for rethinking the kind of correlations and causalities between different things. So going beyond the kind of easy clickbait logic. And it's actually one of my arguments that this zeitgeist story of loss, it's very clickbait compatible. And hence, once things are clickbait compatible, and they are used as critiques of that very same clickbait culture, something strange happens. I mean, it's very snappy to say, apps are designed to make us sad. But I would say there needs to be more critical work going into that analysis of how that happens and who the we in these stories are. And one of the reasons my work builds on the stories of my students, they are not, well, some of them are in their teens, but let's say younger people. It's also a way to think against this generational othering that goes into thinking of younger generations, who've always been wired as kind of permanently damaged and therefore unhappy, sad by design, in a way. And it's also a way of thinking context. So rather thinking that the apps and devices we use are making us distracted, bored, and dependent and empty inside, it makes sense to look at what else is out there in the world that might make us distracted and bored, unhappy or not. And then also the diverse ways in which, let's say, social media are used to tackle such developments. Thinking of the global school strike for climate, thinking of Black Lives Matter, thinking of Me Too, any kind of hashtag movement in the past decade, it's kind of obvious that something else is going on than this kind of hedonistic use of apps and platforms in order to create this kind of distracted, disengaged form of being. Although I'm not against hedonism, that's not my argument. But thank you. I'll end now, and we can move into something a bit more of a dialogue.
Well, thank you very much.